Imagine a life of luxury where having wealth seemed like having happiness, but behind closed doors, there was lots of horrible things happening. This is the story of the Menendez brothers. In the early life, the Menendez brothers, Leo and Eric, were born in a very wealthy family in the early 1970s. Their father, Jose Menendez, was a Cuban immigrant who had to work very hard and became successful later on. Kitty Menendez was a pageant winner and then became a stay-at-home mom when she married Jose Menendez. In the beginning, the boys had a very rough start because Jose Menendez was known for lots of his infidelities. And in an article by Owen Scott, published by the U.S. Sun in 2024, the author says, Jose had many affairs and was even in a secret relationship with another woman for 8 years while his wife descended into alcoholism and drug abuse. Imagine being a kid and seeing all this happening. Well, the boys did not have to imagine, and this was actually happening, which caused them into becoming very emotional, and the father would physically abuse them. Kitty Menendez was very loving and Eric Menendez was very dear of her, but she was so manipulated by her husband that she would often just turn a blind eye to all of the things that were happening to her sons. So the siblings started to grow resentment towards her too. As the siblings grew up to young adults, things started to get more intense as the brothers were heading to college. There was so much pressure that the boys were starting to get really angry at the parents, especially the father. The father was abusing them even more and getting his anger out of them because the boys were doing bad in school and one of them even cheated. So the brothers finally had enough in a boat trip and were planning how they were going to kill the parents. They went to get guns at a Big Five Sporting Goods with a stolen driver's license, and the plan was just to go in there and shoot them, and that is exactly what they did. Jose was shot 6 times and Kitty was shot 10 times, including a shot to her face while Eric reloaded, explains a BBC article by Sam Granville and Crystal Hayes written February 27 of 2025. Another article explains by Jordan Zacharian on the biography on March 10, 2025, explains, it was so barbaric that police thought that the killings were a mob hit. An early investigation focused on business rivals and a porn executive who had a bone to pick with Jose. Something wasn't adding up here because there was no force of entry, so the mob hit was out of the door. And meanwhile, the police were starting to figure something else was happening. The boys were going to therapy, and that is when one of the boys confessed to the therapist, which was Eric Menendez, confessed to the killings. And that is when the therapist told one of his ex-girlfriends, and the ex-girlfriends thought that the therapist was in danger, so she went to tell the police. And after that, the Menendez brothers were arrested a couple months later, and the trial happened. In court, they had mentioned the rape and the abuse that they endured from Jose Menendez, and although there was not sufficient evidence why Kitty got killed, there are speculations that Kitty was just so manipulated by Jose Menendez that the boys were seeing this too, and that there wouldn't be no use of her living on, and that she was like a puppet to him. And they were then sentenced to prison with no possibility of parole for the murder of the parents. Where are they now? The brothers were first separated at prison, one going to California Correctional Institution and the other one going to Folsom State Prison, in a CNN article by Elizabeth Wolf on April 6, 2025. They started to get very famous later on social media and getting lots of support. There was so many GoFundMes and donations, and they haven't made another trial for them, but there is something very interesting that has happened. And I was researching the Menendez brothers. I came across Natalie Moreno's article published on CBS News on March 2nd, 2024, where she said, convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison in a case that captured the nation's attention. There had no hope of ever walking free, but new evidence may change that. There has been new evidence found, and the speculation is that Eric Menendez wrote a card to one of his uncles explaining the abuse that was happening. And we are still waiting on a new trial, but don't know what might happen next as the new proof was found. In conclusion, the story of the Menendez brothers is very complicated, but in a world where wealth and fame can hide terrible abuse, the fight for justice reminds us, even after murder, the truth must and will come to light.